In this module, I'm going to explain to you the basic composition skills that we need to understand to take our photography to a new level. We'll look at the rule of thirds, how to change a perspective, and also how to frame an image when looking at different perspectives. We're also going to be comparing landscape to vertical composition, how you can completely change the perspective of a particular landscape. We're also going to look at diagonal lines, how to use S-curves. There is so much to cover inside of this module, but don't worry, I've broken it down to very simple understanding lessons inside of this module. So when we get into the advanced techniques, we can utilize all these together to get the best possible results for our nature and landscape photography. But just remember, once we understand the exposure module from last lessons and also the composition skills, this is the two requirements that we need to master to get our photography from a beginner all the way to the advanced levels that we're after. In this lesson, I want to give you a quick rundown of the key aspects that we need to look for when going out to take landscape and nature photography images. Generally, to get the best results out of a composition, it's best to get 3 elements combined to make the perfect overall image. And when I say element, I'm talking about scale, light, and how we can utilize these all together. So if we can try and get an image that's got perfect lighting at sunset with scale and a leading line, these are 3 elements that we can combine together to get an overall composition that we're after. Sometimes in landscape photography, we may only get 2 and we can add a 3rd element in. But this is all about basics and advanced composition skills and learning and understanding how to utilize these. And this can all be changed through different focal ranges, through different lenses, and different time of day. So sometimes going out the first time, you're not going to get the best results you possibly can. That is why it's best to go back to the same location numerous times to work on your composition. Composition is something that you have to work on over years and time to get better results as you possibly can. So don't be frustrated right now if you're not getting the results that you're after. It's taking one step at a time. And inside of this module, I'm going to break down all these composition skills separately so you can understand them. Then we're going into the next module, the advanced module. We're going to be combining these all together through elements of focus stacking, using different lenses to combine different composition skills. And this will now take our photography to a completely new level. But just remember, when we're going out to photograph, we're trying to get 3 different elements. So if you're missing one element during the middle of the day, let's say you're focusing on a rock, and in the background you've got color, but you're missing that 3rd element, you can come back later in the day and you've got low light with sunset light occurring, and you've got that 3rd element. The rock in the foreground, the beautiful color's still there, and you've got the light in the background to give you that 3rd element. So this is what I'm talking about, utilizing those rule of thirds, changing perspective, and then adding those 3 elements in the composition skills. We're going to be covering this all in the next 2 lessons, so stick around and hopefully if you understand. If you don't understand, please don't hesitate to contact me and we can work through composition skills because as I said, composition and exposure are 2 very, very important aspects to understand in nature and landscape photography. In this module, we're going to be learning all about composition and even in the next module, learning advanced compositions. But before we get out in the field and learn more of the practical and the essentials that you need to understand with compositions in photography, there's one very simple but must-know rule that we have to understand. This is called the rule of thirds. So I want to very quickly break down what is the rule of thirds and how can we implement it into our photography going forward for our nature photography. The rule of thirds basically can be divided up on the back of the screen, as you can see right now, as sort of 9 grids. So 2 running vertical and 2 running horizontal. And the best way to describe these are guidelines. This is a guideline of how to portray the composition. There are other guidelines that we can use, but just for this course, I'm going to keep it very simple and use the rule of thirds as it's the most effective and most common one you'll be using. So I've come out to this scene here to explain how to use a rule of thirds. Now the bottom horizontal line and the top horizontal line are the main points we're going to be concentrating right now. But progressing forward, I'm going to explain to you where those intersecting points of the rule of third, how we can use them to implement into our photography. But this coincides with using foreground elements or focus stacking. So we're going to get onto that a little bit later. Right now, I want to explain to you the most important rule in the rule of thirds, and that is your horizon line. So we don't want to put our horizon line in the middle. This can be broken when we use a reflection image, as you're seeing right now on the screen. For a reflection image, we want 50-50. So the rule of thirds is actually broken. Remember, this is a guideline. Photography is an art form. So you, as the photographer, can make up what you want to do with your photography. But this is a general guideline for photography and composition. So what I want to try and do is push record on this camera right now and show you what I'm visually talking about. If I'm shooting at 16mm, on that bottom guideline, I want to put what I believe the horizon line is. So we're moving it from the middle to one of those horizon lines in the guideline, so the bottom or top. Now on the top, it looks a little bit weird because we've got so much of the foreground of the river here. So I'm going to move it up to the bottom section of the rule of third. Now this is just not through video or photography. I want to explain to you, if I can shoot at 16mm, 35mm, 55mm, it doesn't matter. I always want to use those guidelines as the guide for my composition. So I want to try and make the imaginary line on the bottom rule of thirds. So what I'm trying to do is get 1/3 of the bottom of the river and 2/3 of the bottom, 2/3 on the top, sorry, for the forest here that's changing color. So we can put this into, if you want, 2/3 of the foreground and 1/3 of the sky. That's what we're trying to do, segregate the horizon line on one of those guidelines. This does change a little bit. As I said, for reflection, it changes completely. But also, if I was to flip this into vertical composition right now, and then use a telephoto, so 55mm, I can now go through and see on the back of my screen that the horizon line or the guideline isn't working out very well because I'm cutting the top of the tree off. So therefore, we want to lose that percentage of 33%, and we might drop down to 25% of the river just to get the top of that tree in. So you can see, we don't always want to precisely follow those guidelines because they are just a guideline. So therefore, I broke it down to 25% of the river and then 75% of the forest in the background. As I said, very simply explained, these are a guideline for putting our horizon line in, but we're going to get more into advanced details about this rule of thirds moving forward in the composition and advanced composition modules in this course. In this lesson, I want to explain to you how to frame an image with a subject now inside of the composition. And this is following on from the previous lessons where I was talking about the guidelines of rule of third. Now, this is also a guideline on how to frame a subject. There are some do's and don'ts inside photography, but we have to remember photography is a creative art form. So we, as the photographer, decide what we like and don't like. And the rules are sort of there to be broken because as far as framing a subject, I said there are do's and don'ts. But later inside this course, we're going to get into minimalist photography and we're actually going to break this rule that we're talking about right now. But rule of thirds, we spoke about those intersecting points on side of the composition itself. Now, with the subject inside the image, now we are photographing this church on a mountain in front of us here, and this is going to be the main subject that I spoke about. So when I spoke about subject, this was also a focusing point. So this is what I'm going to be focusing the subject on. And also we're going to put one of those intersecting points inside those guidelines. Now, I don't want to shoot too wide because if I shoot too wide, it's going to leave the foreground inside of it. Although the subject is inside of those intersecting points, we want to make sure we're getting as much in the frame as possible and not leaving too much away from the distracting eye. Therefore, I've put a telephoto lens on, but we don't want to get too close to the subject. If I go to 200mm, you can see you can't really tell about the background now and what its surrounding area is. So we want to find that perfect balance of focal range, also to those intersecting guidelines. That's why it's handy to have different focal ranges. Now, if I shoot at 135mm, have that intersecting point on the composition with those guideline rule of thirds, it's a really good way to frame the composition. Now, once we get further inside this course and learn about leading lines, diagonals, this is going to make a lot more sense and it's going to add a completely new element inside of our photography. But remember now, guidelines and also those intersecting points for that composition work really, really well for the subject. In this lesson, we're going to discuss the importance of leading lines in our nature photography. This scene in front of me, I've got a beautiful little river running directly in the opposite direction from me, so away from the camera here. Gives us a great perspective of a leading line going into the landscape image. However, I've got it set up in landscape orientation right now. We're going to have a look at both orientations, landscape and also in portrait. From this angle here, I've got in the composition, the river coming from the bottom right-hand side of the frame. Now, although it does look good in the composition, there's one key aspect that I want to look at here, because we went through and discussed about color, scale, and now this leading line in our nature photography. And it's breaking one of the rules here in front of me, because as we follow the river along, it's cutting off. So we can't actually see the heart of the river, the full width of the river. And this is very distracting in the composition. So what we're going to do is pick our camera up and move it all the way across so we can see the river running the full width in the entire composition. So here we are now, just a couple of meters over from where we first were. And this is the first thing about leading lines, making sure the leading line is giving the viewer depth into the image. That's what we're trying to create with a leading line, depth all the way into the image from the bottom all the way to the top. So now we've uncovered the full width of the river. I want to take a look at landscape and also vertical orientation, as we were just talking about. So what I'm going to try and do is get the leading line of the river running directly in the middle of the composition. So with those rule of thirds that we've discussed previously in this module, I'm going to line up the ball head so it is running all the way through the middle of the composition. So just where it is there, and the horizon line is on the top third of the rule of thirds. Now I'm going to set my ISO to 160, or the lowest native ISO your camera can go, because we've got really bright, the sun's out, so it's really bright currently, and also f8 for my aperture. Now I want to have a look at our histogram and make sure we've got all the information inside of our camera. Now I'm setting the compensation dial for the exposure to the entire frame, so the foreground and background. But as I said, it's very well lit just here. So giving me 1/200 is my shutter speed, and the histogram is reading out very well. I might just bump it down to 1/160. It reads out a little bit better, and I've got all that information to take home in the camera. So now I'm going to put a 2-second timer on and just capture that image in landscape orientation. Now, as beautiful as this is, I want to move it to vertical for this situation, because I want to show you, although landscape did look nice, I'm getting a lot of that dead space on the left and right hand side, and because the river is quite narrow, what I can do now is with the ball head, actually angle the camera down a little bit, and it's going to open up the river mouth in front of me and give that viewer all the way into the back of the image. Now with the river, I'm trying to get each side of the bank, so the right-hand side bank coming from the bottom right of the frame and the left-hand side bank on the bottom left-hand side of the frame. So I'm going to go through now and set that up, and that is working absolutely perfectly. So we've got a leading line from the entire part of the bottom frame. Now I want to readjust the polarizer, because we've switched that orientation around. I'm just going to move it to there, and our settings will actually be a 1/200 now. So we're going back just 1/3 of a stop, and that's because we changed it to vertical. We've still got that 1/3 of our rule of thirds as the sky, but it's letting in more light because obviously we've got more sky in the frame. And also down in the initial foreground is actually a lot brighter because the sun's reflecting off the water and hitting into the frame. So now I can go through once again that 2-second timer and capture that image. Now with focusing on both these images, because we haven't got a main subject to focus on, what I'm doing is just focusing in the middle part of the frame, and with focus peaking, making sure I'm getting everything in the foreground, which is in focus, and also the far background. But we want to make sure that the foreground is more in focus than the background, because we're giving that viewer that leading line all the way in. So they want to make sure that is extremely sharp in the foreground, and the background can be a little bit more blurry. But if you have to start up to like f11 to get that bigger depth of frame, you most certainly can. So now 2-second timer, we've got that image in place, and you can see here the vertical composition, and you can look at the first initial landscape image to the second image, like just moving 2 meters to the right hand side. So I haven't moved the camera height at all, just the angle that the image is being taken. And now switching the orientation without the tripod moving at all, you can see the difference of a leading line, what it is doing to our images. It is absolutely perfect. So we have a leading line now, we have some color in the background in the trees, and we also have beautiful golden light right now, giving those 3 incredible elements for this landscape image. In this lesson, I'm going to explain to you the importance of using diagonals in your composition. Previously, we've used S and Z and C curves to use leading lines into our composition, and also just simply using leading lines, getting the viewer's eye going from the bottom of the image all the way into the back of the image, creating depth. But today I want to explain something a little bit different, because on using leading lines and S and C curves, we're getting things coming from the foreground and going into the background. But when we're using diagonals, although we still can use this for diagonals, I want to show you a different way with this landscape today. It's diagonally going into the main part of the composition. So I'm photographing mountains here from the left-hand side and also the right-hand side. We've got the tree line coming in, meeting in the middle of the valley. Also, each side of the valley, the mountains are coming down. This is going into the main center point, which has been lit up by one of the composition elements of light, putting the viewer's eye from the side of the image into the main part of the image. So this is very important. Previously, we were going from the foreground into the background. Here, we are trying to get things to come from the side of the image going in. So if I display this whole image right now, I want to show you the diagonals that I am talking about. We have one diagonal from the left-hand side of the tree line coming into the middle of the image. The same on the right-hand side. Sticking to the right-hand side, we've got the mountain coming down a more steep diagonal. Going up to the left-hand side, we have now 1, 2, and 3 diagonals going down into the main center point of the composition. Now, although this is not leading you into a main composition element, it's giving you a strong tie to go from the right-hand side or the left-hand side into the middle of the image. And the main middle part of the image is obviously the beautiful mountains in the background and the light we are getting. So this is diagonals. We've got diagonals of leading lines going in, but this is going from the left and right-hand side, giving the key elements in a composition of diagonals, perfect for our nature and landscape photography. So now to capture this image, we want to go to 160 ISO like we've done for all our outdoor photography. I'm shooting at f8 and around 23 millimeters. And because it is so bright and we have dark shadows, I need to use the bracketing mode on my camera. Because when I read out one of the histogram, one image, it is reading out too far in the highlights and shadows. So I'm going to go through and bracket at 0 for 1, +2 for +1, and -1 for 0. So we're actually overexposing to capture those highlights. Then I'm going to put a 2-second timer on to capture this beautiful image for our diagonals inside of our composition to enhance our landscape and nature photography. In this lesson, we're going to take a look at using S and Z curves in the foreground of our composition to give it a very different element. Now, although this is very similar to the previous lesson where we're talking about leading lines, don't get them mixed up because there are differences in these two, which I'm about to explain to you right now. So in the previous lesson with leading lines, we used the leading line from the foreground, so making it really large and going all the way into the background, leading, where the name comes from, the viewer's eye all the way into the image. Now, although you can do this with S or Z or C curves, basically using any letter that has a curve in it, in the foreground element, basically from the foreground into the background, giving that snake effect, I want to explain to you a difference here when using diagonals, which we're going to touch on also inside of this course, using diagonals in the composition, because we're trying to create all different elements to give scale, to give that leading line effect into the composition. So you can see on the screen right now a previous image with that snake effect of the road that I'm talking about with the leading lines joined with an S curve. Now I'm photographing an S curve, but what I'm trying to do is combine it with a diagonal. So you can see we've got leading line with an S curve or Z curve, and also a diagonal with an S and Z curve. So you can use them all different kinds of way, and the more artistic you get, that is what photography is about. It's about an art form and creating your own images. So here I've got it from the bottom right-hand corner leading our way into the image. So basically coming from the bottom right-hand corner leading to the right-hand side. Then we've got a hut just in front of me here, which is giving us scale. In the mountains in the background, giving us scale once again, and some lighting in the background also. So now I want to go through and set up the composition in the back of the camera. Setting our ISO at 160 or the native lowest ISO on your camera, moving the aperture to f8 where we want to shoot those landscape and nature photography images. And then we want to go now and check the histogram. This is where it becomes very important because the foreground is completely in shadow because the sun is setting behind me here. Now, because the mountains are almost 3,000 meters, that's getting light on it, and there's snow on there, so it's making it very, very bright. So we're having to deal with extreme shadows and extreme highlights. Now, when I put it to a single exposure, you can see the histogram is clipping both in the highlights and shadows. So now you have to go into that more advanced setting of bracketing. Now, when I go into bracketing, I know at 0, the highlights and shadows are both clipping. So what I have to do is set it to around 1. So 1 is going to be 0, +1 is going to be +2, and now -1 is going to be 0, because when that -1, I can get those highlights in the mountains, in the snow, and reduce them in post-production. Then for the +1, which would be +2, when shooting that bracketing exposuring, I can bump up the shadows and then blend them together in post-production, which we're going to learn in the last module inside of this course. So now I've got all those settings, and we know 160 ISO, we know f8 for our aperture. We now know we're going to shoot 3 bracket exposure at +1, +2, and 0. Now I want to go through and focus. I want to focus on the hut here first, because at f8, when I focus on the hut, I'm getting the foreground here, which I can see in the composition, and the mountains in the background in focus. But I can tell on the back of the camera that the road and hut and the trees in the sort of the mid-ground there are really sharp, which is what we're after, because that leading line going back into the image. Now the mountains are going to be sharp enough, which is very, very important. But we don't want it to be the main focal point of the image because it's going to make the foreground blurry. So now I can put a 2-second timer on. I'm just going to recheck. So I'm going to shoot at 1, 2, and 0. So +1, -1, and 0. 2-second timer. I'm going to go ahead and capture that image. And you can see the blended image on the screen right now. And with that leading line of that S curve, you can make a Z curve, a C curve, which can see all these images being displayed on the screen right now. You can basically go as crazy as you want with the curves, leading lines in the foreground to give that viewer. What would make this composition a little bit better is if the road did go into the mountains, so towards the mountains. This would give the viewer a lot easier to go into the back of the image. At the moment, they go off to the left-hand side, which is a little bit distracting. So what I could do right now is spend more time at this composition, even changing it into vertical composition and trying to shoot that way to get that leading line working the way I want. That is the great thing about photography. It takes a long, long, long time to get the perfect composition, but once you do, it makes your nature and landscape photography absolutely breathtaking. Getting creative with different focal ranges. That's what we're talking about on today's lesson. If you own multiple lenses like I do, wide angle, mid telephoto and telephoto zoom lenses, what do you do with them? Today, I'm going to explain to you different ways that we can achieve scale by using different focal ranges. And we're going to stay at exactly the same location to show you that you don't need to change locations, you just have to change lenses and change your way that you're viewing the composition. So what we're going to do today is we're going to use this leading line of the road that we've talked about previously on this course. I'm going to go and stand out in the middle of the road in this composition to give scale. This is going to make sense because we're going to use a wide angle. Right now I'm using a 10 to 24mm from Fujifilm, and later I'm going to use a telephoto. So we're going from one extreme, really wide angle. At the moment, I'm shooting around 14mm, and next we're going to use a telephoto, a completely different perspective on exactly the same composition. So right now I'm going to 160 ISO, my lowest native ISO, f8, the same settings that we're normally shooting for. We are going to bracket this because I'm getting the histogram reading out, clipping sort of on both sides, but it is pretty good. I think we can get most of it back from a single image, which would be great, because I'll be standing in the image, and when we bracket those images, I might move just a little bit. So I'm going to try and use just one out of those 3 bracketing images. What we're going to do for focusing is we're going to use f8, as we said. For wide angle, it's going to be very easy because we want everything in focus, especially me. When we get telephoto, which we're going to do on next part of this lesson, it's going to be a little bit harder because we're going to obviously compress the whole image. So what I'm going to do now is bracket that. We're getting a shutter speed readout of 1/50, once again shooting at 0, 1 and 2. So 1 will be our 0, and +1 would be our 2, -1 would be our 0 for those highlights. Now, we normally set a 2-second timer, but for this I'm going to set a 10-second timer because I have to run out in the front of the image. So I'm focusing basically on the end of the road here. We're getting everything from the mountains in the background to this leading light of the road in the foreground in focus. So now I'm going to go through now and capture the first image. Then I'm going to change lenses and show you the difference perspective of exactly the same composition. So 10-second timer, I'm going to run out in the composition. So there we have the image, wide angle, beautiful, beautiful image. But now we're getting a lot lower to the ground and I've changed over to the telephoto. This is a 55 to 200. And then what we're trying to do here is compress the image. So before we had a really wide field of view. Now we want to narrow that field of view down with exactly or very similar composition to a shot with wide angle, but shooting it through the eyes of a telephoto lens. The reason I've had to get a lot lower is because the ground elevates up because I've had to move a long, long way back, obviously because of the telephoto. I can't move any further back because the elevation gets higher and higher. So to compensate for that, I've had to lower the tripod as much as possible so I can get the leading line of that road at 55 millimeters. The rest of the settings haven't changed, so 160 ISO, f8, and we're still going to bracket exposure. But lowering that ISO, I get the leading line of the road and that beautiful big mountain and the light just in the top of the composition here. So once again, a single exposure does read out very well, but I am going to bracket exposure just to make sure I've got all that information in play. So here is the image of a telephoto you can see on the screen right now. It is completely different perspective and it looks like you're in a completely different location to shooting wide angle. So that is getting creative with different focal ranges. So what I suggest for this is to head out to a location, find a wide angle image to shoot, even a mid-range image to shoot, and also a telephoto image to shoot of the same composition like I have today. Really understand what is changing in camera. Wide angle, really wide field of view, getting as much information as we possibly can in the single composition. Telephoto, we're almost minimalizing what we are capturing in the back of the screen. In the camera is very, very difficult to understand until you go out and practice that. But once you understand telephoto photography and wide angle photography, you'll know once you get to a composition or a scene like I did today, what you want to shoot and how it's sort of going to look in post-production. So go out and get creative with different focal ranges in nature and landscape photography. You'll absolutely love it and see all the images in a completely different aspect. In this lesson, I want to explain to you how we can change the composition completely through framing. So previously we've gone through and looked at different focal ranges to change the complexity of the composition itself. But today I want to talk about the framing using the same lens. So previously we switched from a wide angle to a telephoto lens. But right now we're going to use the same composition and the same subject to capture two very different images just through framing. So the first image I want to go through and find out is the tree here in front of me with the mountains in the background. Now these mountains in the background are over 2,000 meters, and this tree here in front of me is maybe 8 to 10 meters high. I want to give this a completely different look through framing. So the first image I'm going to go through and take is at 160 ISO f8, the same for our landscape and nature photography, and that has given me a readout of 1/25 for a single exposure. You can see that image right now. Although I'm going to use a different focal range, I am using the same lens, but the biggest difference we are seeing right now is the framing of the image. So I'm going to go through and recompose this image and make it a tighter crop. So just focusing on the tree once again, keeping the same settings, I'm going to go through and take that single exposure. Now you can see the difference. We've got the same tree and the same mountains in the background, but a completely different image, and this is all to do with framing. The biggest thing I can say is we don't know how big those mountains are in the background now because the top of the frame is cut off. So what this is doing is generating more questions for the audience to ask how big those mountains are, how far they are away. Where before in the framing, we could see the top of the mountains, we knew roughly how big they were, how far they are away. So this is how we change the difference between our framing and also different focal ranges in our landscape and nature photography. It can set your photography completely apart for a very unique image. In this lesson, I want to explain to you one of the simplest compositions that we can achieve in nature photography. And the best thing is, once it is done correctly, it looks absolutely beautiful and it's really easy to get beautiful results. So what I'm doing today is capturing a reflection image. There's a couple of rules that we need to remember when shooting reflection photography. Now, one of them is quite funny because I went through and broke down the rule of thirds, and as we progressed through the composition module, we've talked about rule of thirds and how we can implement it with the composition or foreground elements. In this lesson, we're going to completely break that rule of third rule. So what we want to try and do is put the horizon line directly in the middle. Previously, I've explained to you we never want to put the horizon line in the middle. It's either on the bottom 1/3 or top 1/3. So you're probably asking, why would you put it directly in the middle? Because we want to create a 50-50 divide for that reflection. So we can get a perfect reflection. And when we're cropping things or putting things in the composition, we want to make sure we're getting the exact same result from top to bottom. Now, the second very important rule when shooting reflection photography is we always want to make sure the bottom 50% or the reflection is darker than the top 50% or the main composition, because that is how it is in reality. In real life, the water or reflection is a lot darker than the actual nature itself. So these are the two rules we need to abide by. So right now I'm going to go through, I'm shooting on a very wide angle. I'm also using another rule of thirds in the vertical. So I've got this little hut here in the water, and I want to make sure that's on the right-hand side of the vertical standing up, not directly in the middle. So I've composed that, and I want to go through and shoot at f8. Then I want to go through and shoot at a native ISO of 160, and that is giving me 1 second of the shutter speed. So we're only going to use a single exposure for this image, and we're going to focus directly on the hut that's standing up. We don't want to make sure that the foreground is in focus because remember, it is a reflection image. It will be a little bit in focus, but we really want to make sure on the top 50% of the element. So I'm going to put a 2-second timer on, double check that focus on the hut, and we're going to go through and take that image. Now, very, very simple, because in post-production, we're going to go through and I can show you exactly how we want to make sure the bottom 50% is around that 10 or 15% darker than the top. But this is the simplest composition that you can achieve in nature and landscape photography. And the best thing, once again, I've already said, is once it's done correctly, it is so beautiful and easy to achieve these results. So I highly recommend to go out and take a very simple reflection image with perfect lighting and perfect color. Today, I've got beautiful fall colors, which adds to the element, and it's very simple to achieve beautiful results in your nature and landscape images.